Okay, today we're doing a lesson on the theory of social Darwinism. Okay, social Darwinism is a social or political narrative, whereas people viewed societies or cultures in a sort of survival of the fittest competition, in a sense that people thought they could rank societies, and the best society would thrive, survive, and further humanity. Okay, previous lessons we learned about causes and the areas that were imperialized in the 1800s. This lesson's on social Darwinism as a theory. And an additional material is a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the poem We and They. It is a good poem to look into the thinking of social Darwinism. Okay, a quick note. Social Darwinism is yet again another 19th and 20th century attempt at a grand narrative, an attempt at political scientists, philosophers, to try to solve or explain the human condition in simple, direct terms, such as just as the scientists were figuring things out rather well, the philosophers thought that they too could find a unifying theory about how humans do exist and how they should exist. And like all other spectacularly failures of the grand narratives of the 1800s, it was far too simplistic to actually be, to encompass all of humanity. Following it caused the suffering of millions, and it was eventually rejected. Once again, these things are dangerous. Reducing the human condition to one simple answer and then molding the world at all cost to fit how you think it should be, it certainly did not work out well. Other narratives were unregulated capitalism at the time, laissez-faire capitalism without government involvement. That did not work out well. And the narrative of Marxism, with wealth being an oppressor and an oppressed. So wealth and unwealth and oppressor oppressed. Viewing humanity in that lens did not work out well either. It was a failed grand narrative. A couple related terms and vocabulary that are related to social Darwinism that are not exactly the same. One is ethnocentrism, the belief one's culture is superior to others. Now, all social Darwinists are ethnocentric, but not all ethnocentric countries are social Darwinists. The difference is countries can be ethnocentric and still be isolated and not trying to play a competition survival of the fittest, where social Darwinists admit that cultures will come into contact and the superior, quote-unquote, one will survive and continue. Nationalism is promoting one's country. Usually we use this in terms of a policy or a movement to promote one's country, and patriotism is just love of one's country. So I guess if we were to look at it as a hierarchy or a linear in a line, starting with patriotism, people have love for their own country. This is usually seen as a good, not a negative. Patriotism can turn into nationalism, promoting one's country through a policy and movement. Nationalism can be seen as good or bad, depending if it infringes upon other nations. Nationalism could turn into ethnocentrism, the belief that one's culture is superior. Usually that's seen as more bad than good. And ethnocentrism can turn into social Darwinism, belief one culture is superior, and that through competition it should be spread and others should be like it. Okay, before we go into social Darwinism, we have to explore very briefly the history of cultures feeling that they are superior to other societies. Now, each one of these is a fairly interesting talk into and unto itself, and you can definitely go in and each one of these think a lot about and learn a lot more. But we'll keep it on a very surface level right now. So, suffice it to say, all societies in all of history engaged in tribalism. Okay, so in all societies, almost at all time, humans tend to form an in-group and an out-group. Okay, and we call it tribalism because it started with villages and tribes. And villages joined together in tribes, in groups, and all villages not in one tribe was an out-group. So all villages in the tribe were favored, and all people outside the tribes were usually looked down on or not favored. Going forward, tribalism can be seen over and over in cities and in countries, and in fact, anywhere that humans create identity or divides amongst themselves, in comes the idea of tribalism, which creates an in-group and an out-group. And Unless actively managed, tribalism does cause favoring the in-groups and looking down on the out-groups. So in general, tribalism is something we try to fight against. As cities and empires and nations formed, another term comes in, which is very similar to tribalism, is ethnocentrism. The belief that one's own society is superior to the societies around it. And I would argue that very, very many societies and nations were ethnocentric in history to some degree. Now, it is entirely natural to like your own society, to feel comfortable with your own society, because it is a known quantity, and it seems the case that if one does not know other societies, they are unknown, and sometimes people fear the unknown, so it seems to come that the slight dislike or from the slight unknown of other cultures make an uncomfortableness that could be seen as dislike. Now, a little bit of that seems to be built in to how things work, but ethnocentrism really takes it to the next level, where it's a common idea in a society that the whole society is better than other societies. So it's something that's really obvious in a society, and when it gets to that level, it's called ethnocentrism. A couple examples of this in the past. The Greeks, Athens, Sparta, and the other city-states were ethnocentric, considering peoples from the north as barbarians. Ironically, those northern peoples ended up conquering the Greeks and ending the civilization. Now, it's interesting to note that the Greeks were ethnocentric as Greeks, but they were also tribal, too. The Athenians had in-groups, and Sparta was on the out-group, so there was tribalism within the Greeks also. The ancient Chinese considering themselves the Middle Kingdom was a sign of ethnocentricity, and considering people from the north as barbarians, and the irony comes back again as the people from the north, the Mongols from the north, end up conquering China and ruling them for a couple generations. The Tokugawa shogunate in Japan isolated Japan for 100 years, and we see that's a result of ethnocentrism. The Tokugawa liked the Japanese culture and did not like other cultures, so they isolated Japan to separate the cultures. And kind of in modern history, in the 1700s on, we start getting a clearly defined ideas of countries and nation states, and that's when we start getting the terms patriotism and nationalism, loving one's country and supporting one's country often in policy. Now, this is patriotism and nationalism really go to the state. There could be often diverse populations, different religions, different ethnicities, but the pride and the love goes towards the state itself. So patriotism and nationalism can be a unifying force. There can be many diverse religions and ethnicities and languages and people all in one country. All of those diverse people can be unified by patriotism and nationalism. Okay, so put that countries and people in countries love themselves sometimes too much, put that off to the side. And we're going to come right back and merge that with a whole brand new idea that was coming on in the 1800s. So first let's talk about, in the animal and plant species, what's going on in biology. And we're going to move that to humans. Okay, so it's a little aside, but it's important to understand. In the mid-1800s, Charles Darwin was a biologist, and he was creating a revolutionary theory of how life evolves. Just like a lot of scientists were just figuring out a really, really good theories that seem to work quite a bit for observing a lot in nature. So basically, Charles Darwin is saying, well, how do species grow? How do species change? How do species survive? And Charles Darwin's idea was that to get this evolution of a species, that the best and most fittest and most adapted members of a species will survive and reproduce. That's called natural selection. So the most adapted and successful members, they reproduce, and thus the species changes to get stronger, to get better, because they're the ones that survived, okay? So that's how over time, Charles Darwin is saying a species will change and have traits and get more adapted to surviving in the world. And this is through basically competition. What kind of competition? Competition to survive and produce offspring. So members of a species that are more successful, better adapted, will produce more of their children, changing the species. And this seems to hold up pretty true for gradual changes of a species and adaptations to the environment. And it was, at that time, it was fairly logical and for some fairly obvious. So much so that in 10 years, from 1860 to 1870, it became a popular, widespread, popular, and accepted enough that it was out there as a theory, and many people were talking about it and thinking about it. Well, how did that apply to humans? Well, it didn't. Not in Charles Darwin's writings. But a lot of people that followed him started thinking of humans as just another species. So what we have is we have people who are already primed to think that their culture is better than others, because that's sort of a natural thing that happens over and over and over. So people are already primed to think that cultures are either superior or inferior. Now there's this idea that a competition and a survival of the fittest in animals and plants and that. So the jump to, well, maybe people are playing that game too. Like, what's the difference between a pack of wolves and people? What's the difference between the animals Charles Darwin observed and human societies? And so thus, in the 1870s, social Darwinism came about. Once again, it's a bunch of philosophers trying to be like the scientists and saying, let's have a theory that explains human nature. And then once we know the theory, we can, I don't know, make the world a utopia and a better place. Well, as we learned before, human nature is far too complex to be boiled down to something that can be put on one sheet of paper. And so in the end, it did not work out as well as they thought. So what they were doing is taking Darwin's ideas and applying them to the human species, human society, human culture. So thus, the social Darwinist theory states, societies and cultures are in conflict to find out the survival of the fittest. And so the fit cultures, the better cultures, quote unquote, will survive, will take over, will populate the earth. This was all later extended to economic classes, saying poor, middle, rich, ultra-rich were all in competition, and those who were best adapted would rise on the social status, and those who were not were lower on the social status. And the theory taught that it was natural, because if it's seen in nature, then it's natural. And there's a natural fallacy that says if it's in nature, then it's good. I believe they were believing that at the time. And so the theory taught it was natural and good for humanity, or for a dominant culture, to spread and replace survival and spread of the fittest. The idea of if it was good for animals, it was good for human society. So how then, if that was the idea, then how was somebody, or how was humanity to judge which societies were more fit, better adapted to survive, and which societies should spread across the world? In the animal kingdom, in the plants and everything, that's easier to find. Whichever produces the most offspring, whichever doesn't get eaten by a predator and lives to reproduce. And so nature takes care of that. But how does one judge at society? Because in the world of the 1800s, every society was doing fine enough. Every society was stable enough, reproducing and doing, quote, fine enough. They weren't going extinct in certain areas. So nature doesn't say, so every society based on nature was doing great. So where does that leave social Darwinism? Well, they had to make up a way to judge societies. See, social Darwinism is not a very good theory. It doesn't really fit on so many levels, but they tried to make it fit, because that's what they do when you have a grand narrative in the 18 and 1900s and you want to mold the world to your own belief. So they had to make up how to judge societies. And here's what they came up with. And it's no surprise that the people who were promoting social Darwinism, which was the Western European countries at the time, they came up with criteria that basically said their countries were the most fit to survive. It's no surprise that someone making up the rules to the game are going to make up rules where they win. So technology was seen as meaning a society was superior. Machines, military, and energy. Capitalism was seen as meaning a culture was superior, because it would give wealth generation. The factory system was seen as superior because it could produce more than anything, and it used more resources. And the more use of resources was seen as a good thing. And we could see that there might be some arguments. Superior is not the correct word, but if you think about it, countries with a stronger military can win fights. Okay, countries with machines can do more work. Capitalism is an economic system based upon competition. So capitalism, buying and selling, and competition, capitalism put anywhere else in the world will win because it's built on competition. And the factory system does use more resources and it does produce more. So you could see those, and they see that, and they said superior. Well, it doesn't mean superior. It just means exactly what we just said. Better at producing things, better at using resources, better at taking over other countries. That doesn't mean superior. And then there's one that is just absolutely objective and biased. Western civilization, how the Europeans dressed, the Christianity as a religion was seen as civilized and superior. And that one is just opinionated bias. Okay, so remember, social Darwinism says survival of the fittest, and if the fittest survive and quote-unquote win, it is natural and good for a species. And social Darwinists believe that the cultures that survive, conquer, rule, and grow, it is better for the good of humanity. And so this gave an excuse, whatever you want to call it, excuse, justification, reason for the Europeans to feel good about imperializing and not bad about imperializing. Because, look, it is obvious taking over other countries is taking over other countries. It is obvious that changing people's traditions when they're taken over, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of thinking, creative thinking, to think that that might be bad. One wouldn't want it done to you. Do unto others as you want them to do unto you. So it's not like people didn't wonder, hey, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Taking over other countries and hurting other cultures, destroying other cultures, changing other cultures. And this would be social Darwinism, a reason, an excuse where it's not really a bad thing because it's quote unquote survival of the fittest, natural and good for the species. Cecil Rhodes was one of these imperialists who went down into South Africa, founded De Beers Diamond Company, which is still around today, one of the largest diamond companies, although there's competition in the last 15 years, which is a good thing. Competition in a market's very good and brings the prices down too on diamonds. He was a British imperialist, wanted to take over many places in Africa, build railroads, etc., but he was also, from his quote, seemed to be quite a strong social Darwinist. Let's look at a quote. Quoted, "I contend that we Britons are the first race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses." Okay, socially Darwinistic, right? First race in the world means best race in the world. The more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. So that would be survival of the fittest, spreading of the group. It is their duty to seize and acquire more territory to spread. Simply means more of the British, more of the Anglo-Saxon, more of, quote, the best, the most human. And that's social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest. And the fittest surviving is natural and good for humanity. So there's a couple different ways to look at why social Darwinism is a pretty bad narrative. It doesn't work. It doesn't take into account other things. It's a failed narrative. There's different ways to prove the claim that it's a bad narrative. You can take your pick on what you want to go with, right? I think a simple one is Darwinism works with animals, survival of the fittest, because all that's important to animals is living. So the best animal, the animal that lives is the best. Okay, there's no opinion there. It's a truth. The animal that lives and reproduces is the best. Social Darwinism doesn't work because humans care about how we live. And now opinions come into matter. What is a good life? What is success of the human species? Success of an animal species is just living to reproduce. But what is success of a human species? Is it cooperation? Is it science? Is it technology? Is it leisure time? Is it not destroying the environment? All of these things are opinions. So it is impossible to have a firm belief of which culture is, quote unquote, better, because there isn't a goal for humanity. All human societies can live long enough to reproduce and perpetuate their society, okay? Then there's the opinion is what is a good life. And unless you can answer the goal of humanity, you cannot answer which society is better. So that's my reason it fails as a narrative. But there's others. The social Darwinism of the time assumed that resources and technology and strength were superior and is the goal for the species. So because the Europeans could imperialize, because they could take over, that meant they were the fittest in the social Darwinistic time. Well, that just all it means is that they could conquer. It doesn't mean that they were more adapted to the world. Just going off of that one, humans can cooperate instead of survival of the fittest. Okay, this game doesn't even need to be played. Okay, even saying that this is the only game of humans, that it's the grand narrative and this is how it has to be. No, humans don't have to compete to survive. Humans can cooperate to survive. And so that takes social Darwinism right out of there. We're not looking for the best society. We're looking to work together with whatever societies we have. Social Darwinism leads to racism and racist thinking, okay? Social Darwinism is categorizing cultures and societies as superior and inferior and fit and unfit. That is racist talk and racist thinking. There's slight difference in definitions, but one leads to the other and reinforces the other, and the other leads to the other and reinforces the other. Problems with social Darwinism. It leads to genocide, war, and eugenics. And this was the case in the later social Darwinism in the 1900s, where people were so convinced that their society or their people were the best that they would actually try to get rid of and genocide other societies. And wars were fought to take over. And so it's a problem. If your grand narrative leads to genocide and war, I mean, not a good way to go through life. Problems with social Darwinism. It removes cultural diversity. Different ways of doing things are strengths because different ways of doing things are good at different times and different situations. And so to have more cultures that do and think and speak and act differently, it adds to the diversity, which is stronger when situations change and we need different ideas and different modes of living. Fun little fact with Darwinism, right? That's what the genetics, all children are born slightly different, or there's gene mutations to keep the diversity in a population, right? And so even survival of the fittest in nature doesn't destroy all diversity. Okay, there's always the genetic mutations to help when a population needs it. So you can't, social Darwinists, want to destroy all the diversity. You can't do that. Even nature says you can't destroy all the diversity because you're going to need it someday. And if you weren't convinced before, social Darwinism led to Hitler. Simple as that. Hitler's World War II was based on the Nazi thought of a pure German, superior Übermensch race of people, and that is literally what spurred on World War II for Germany taking over other countries, more room for his race of people, and the Holocaust trying to genocide Jews, Romana, and many other people. I mean, if you don't believe me, go back to Cecil Rhodes right here. And Cecil Rhodes was talking about the British. Just change the words to Adolf Hitler in World War II, and you will see that Hitler is actually speaking social Darwinism. Hitler would say that he contends that the Germans are the first race in the world, more of the world that the Germans inhabit, the better. He went to war for territory, better for the human race. It's the Germans' duty to seize every opportunity, acquiring more territory, okay? Means more of the, he would call the Aryan race, more of the best, more of the most human, more of the most honorable race the world possesses. So you could see that the driving force of Hitler and Nazi Germany, National Socialism ideology of a superior race is exactly from the social Darwinism's social Darwinistic thinking of the 1780s and the 1770s and 90s. It is the same thinking. So that's a pretty good reason to stay away from social Darwinism, because we saw what it led to. Not only did it lead to imperialism, which we don't like nowadays, taking over other countries, but it literally led to Hitler and the ideology of a superior race, which led Hitler to start World War II. So where is social Darwinism today? And the answer is, it isn't. It is widely viewed as a failed narrative that caused untold amounts of human suffering, and it is not to be tried again. It is accepted that the destruction and replacement of cultures, taking over other nations, and imperialism is bad. We have United Nations specifically tries to stop countries from going to war and taking over other countries. Okay, it is seen that diversity of cultures is beneficial, and that the social Darwinism was replaced by the idea that diversity of cultures is beneficial, and then instead of survival of the fittest culture, it's replaced with, now we're a world of a mix of cultures, blending of cultures, preserving cultures, and discussing and arguing about different ways to do things, not trying to figure out which way is best through takeover or force. And we have replaced the idea of survival of the fittest to cultural, societal, national rights to exist. Countries can be inefficient. Countries can be non-industrial. Countries can have small militaries and not the strongest military power, and they still have a right to exist. It doesn't mean they're inferior cultures or inferior countries. It doesn't mean that they should be taken over like a social Darwinist would say. It's okay for different cultures and countries to exist in a world, regardless of how rich the countries are, regardless of how many factories, regardless of many, many things. But be careful. Like all of the failed narratives of the 1800s and 1900s, people and countries are still enticed by them. They still might like it and might want to try it again. See, the fact is, these are simple narratives, simple and seductive ways of viewing the world. Someone can learn it just like that, easy to learn, and it promises to fix whatever's going wrong. That's the thing. So social Darwinism is easy to learn, easy to think about, and it promises to let you understand the world and fix the world. This is why they became so popular, and people followed it. And they just were all too simple and ended in untold misery. So be careful, because people are always looking for answers, and these are still out there. So specifically, we're looking at countries that would want to spread and replace other cultures, countries that want to take over other cultures. We're looking at groups that think certain groups and certain cultures are better and superior, and that gives them special privileges to act in the world. So basically, be careful of social Darwinism coming back as a narrative. And my best argument against it is the argument of, it has been tried before. It has been tried many times, and it has not worked to any degree. So the chances of social Darwinism being tried and successful are slim, and in my opinion, to none. And what happened when it was tried? Racism, racist thinking, genocide, war, eugenics, removal of cultural diversity, and literally World War II and Hitler. It's been tried before. And that's an overview of social Darwinism. So thanks for watching.